The morning of October 14, 1944, started like any other at RNAS Stretton, the British airfield that hosted a handful of American squadrons under joint command. I was flying a Vought F4U Corsair, one of the Navy's finest fighters, fast, brutal, and unpredictable, much like the men who flew it. We had been briefed to escort a formation of B-24 Liberators striking a munitions depot near Koblenz, deep inside German territory. It was supposed to be a clean run, in and out before noon. The weather betrayed us first. Low cloud cover rolled in across the channel, and by the time we crossed the Rhine, visibility had dropped to near zero. The Germans were waiting. Flak burst around us like black blossoms, shaking the Corsair until every rivet screamed. I remember the smell of oil and cordite, the flash of an exploding B-24 ahead of me. And then, the engine shuddered. A single shell had torn through the cowling and shredded the oil line. The Corsair, my beautiful blue devil, began to die. I radioed my wingman, Ensign Red Halley, but static drowned his reply. Smoke poured into the cockpit. I pulled the canopy release and prayed the fire wouldn't follow me out. The last thing I saw before I jumped was the Rhine River cutting through the valley, like a strip of dark glass. The next was the ground coming up fast. I hit a patch of forest somewhere west of Koblenz, my parachute snagging in a line of tall pines. My right leg took the worst of it, a bad twist, maybe a fracture. I cut myself loose, crawled under a fallen log, and waited. The cold was unbearable, but fear kept me awake. For hours, I listened to the sound of trucks and dogs in the distance. The Germans were sweeping the area. They found me by morning. 2 soldiers in gray field coats, rifles slung across their shoulders, came through the trees. One shouted, and before I could even raise my hands, a rifle butt slammed into my ribs. They were young boys, really, no older than 20. I told them I was an American naval officer. They laughed and called me Flieger, flyer. They took my sidearm, my watch, and the small photo of my wife, Ellen, from my flight jacket pocket. I never saw it again. That night, they brought me to a makeshift outpost near Beaufort, where a truck waited to carry prisoners east. I remember the smell of diesel, the frost forming on the canvas roof, and the realization that I had crossed from the world of flyers into the world of prisoners. The war, for me, was over. But what came next would test the limits of what a man could endure, and what he could learn to live with. The transport truck rattled eastward for hours, bouncing along frozen roads lined with leafless birch trees and half-buried artillery pieces. The guards smoked and talked in low voices, laughing from time to time. Though none of us prisoners spoke, there were 6 of us in the back, 2 British, 1 Canadian, and 3 Americans, all shot down within days of each other. We didn't exchange names that first night. We just sat there, wrapped in silence and the stink of diesel, knowing that introductions could wait until survival no longer felt like a gamble. By dawn, we reached the rail yard at Limburg and Erlangen. From there, a train took us north, Oxcars, 40 men to a car, no heat, no water. I later learned we were bound for Stalag Luft IV, a Luftwaffe-run prisoner of war camp near the town of Gross Tyczów, then in Pomerania, now Tyczewo, Poland. It was January 1945, the coldest winter I've ever known. When the train doors opened after 2 days, the cold hit like a wall. Rows of watchtowers loomed over barbed wire fences that glittered in frost. Guards with machine guns paced along the perimeters. Behind them, wooden barracks squatted in the snow, smoke rising from a few cracked chimneys. We were herded out, counted, lined up. A German officer, thin, hawk-faced, his voice clipped with authority, looked us over as though we were livestock. He introduced himself as Oberstleutnant Heinrich Kruger, camp commandant. He told us, in perfect English, "You are airmen. You are not criminals. Behave as such, and you will live to see your home again." That promise meant little then, but I would come to learn he was, in his own way, a man of peculiar honor, rare among his peers. Inside the barracks, the air was heavy with sweat, damp straw, and the faint smell of kerosene. Dozens of men lay on wooden bunks, wrapped in blankets so thin they might as well have been paper. A Royal Air Force officer named Squadron Leader Thomas Harland offered me a spot beside him. He was pale, with hollow cheeks and eyes that still managed to burn with defiance. He told me he'd been there 8 months, since being shot down over the Ruhr. "You'll get used to it," he said. "The hunger, the cold, even the lice, but never the waiting." Food came twice a day, watery cabbage soup in the morning, a crust of dark bread and a sliver of margarine in the evening. Once a week, if the Red Cross parcels arrived, we'd share tins of Spam and powdered coffee, turning the event into a small celebration. Letters from home were censored but treasured. I received my first one in March, Ellen's handwriting, telling me she was safe in Ohio and praying for my return. I must read it 50 times before tucking it into my boot. Work details began soon after. I was sent outside the main wire, part of a crew assigned to repair fences and clear snow from the access roads. It was hard labor, but better than the stillness inside. Some of the guards, older reservists, weary from the war, treated us with a kind of indifferent pity. Others took pleasure in their power, barking orders, striking men who stumbled. You learned quickly who was which. One afternoon, as we cleared a drainage ditch near the outer wall, I noticed Kruger himself watching us from a distance. He approached, boots crunching in the snow, and stopped beside me. "Lieutenant Morrison, yes?" he asked, glancing at the faded name on my flight jacket. I nodded. "You flew the Corsair, the American fighter?" "Yes, sir." He studied me for a moment, then said quietly, "A beautiful machine. Dangerous, but beautiful." Then he turned and walked away. That small exchange stayed with me, not because of what he said, but because it was the first time in months that anyone, enemy or friend, spoke to me as a man rather than a number. But that winter was only the beginning. The war was turning, and soon even the guards would fear what came from the east. For us prisoners, the nightmare would shift from captivity to survival itself. By February 1945, rumors spread through Stalag Luftwaffe like wind through broken glass. Whispers said the Russians were pushing west, closer every day. Some guards looked nervous, others angry. The officers among us could sense the tension building, the uncertainty that war brings when the tide begins to turn. For the prisoners, hope and fear became the same thing. Hope that liberation was near, fear that we wouldn't live long enough to see it. Each morning began the same, the clang of the camp bell, the bitter air cutting through our lungs as we stumbled out for apple, roll call. Rows of hollow-eyed men, hundreds of us standing ankle-deep in snow, waiting while guards counted and recounted, barking in German when someone swayed or coughed. Frostbite was a constant companion. Many wrapped their feet in rags or newspaper just to keep feeling them. The Red Cross parcels had stopped coming. The last one I saw was in January. After that, we lived on boiled turnips and black bread, thinner by the day. I'd lost nearly 30 pounds. My flight jacket hung loose like a borrowed coat. Yet, strangely, life settled into a rhythm, hunger, cold, and the quiet defiance of men who refused to vanish. Inside the barracks, time blurred. We carved chess pieces from wood scraps, traded stories about home, and listened to the old BBC broadcasts someone had hidden on a smuggled radio. They said the Allies had crossed the Rhine. They said Berlin was being bombed nightly. Each rumor felt like a heartbeat from another world. Squadron leader Harland, the RAF officer I'd befriended, kept a small notebook where he recorded every bit of news we heard. "For history," he said. "If we live through this, people will want to know what happened here." I sometimes wonder if that notebook survived. Maybe it sits now in some archive beside my own words, a quiet testament to the men who refused to be forgotten. In late February, a change came. Commandant Kruger gathered the senior officers and told them the camp would be evacuated. The Russians were only weeks away, he said. We were to be marched west, across Pomerania, toward the interior of Germany. No one cheered. We'd heard what those marches meant. Hundreds of miles through snow, little food, men dying by the roadside. That night, I couldn't sleep. The barracks creaked in the wind. Somewhere outside, a guard sang a slow, sad tune in German, Lily Marlene. The sound drifted through the cracks like smoke. For a moment, I thought of Ellen, of her letter, folded soft from being read so many times. I imagined her waiting by the radio, wondering if I was alive. I wanted to believe I'd see her again. But faith was hard to hold when even hope froze in your breath. The next morning, we packed what we could carry, a blanket, a tin cup, maybe a scrap of bread. The gates opened, and the column began to move. Nearly 6,000 of us, Americans, British, Canadians, even a few Poles and Norwegians. The guards marched beside us, their faces gray with fatigue. Snow fell hard, turning the road into slush. The line stretched for miles, a trail of broken men disappearing into the white horizon. That was the beginning of what history would later call the Long March. One of the last cruel acts of a dying war. The first day of the march was chaos. 6,000 men stumbling through frozen mud, snow blinding our eyes, boots already soaked through. The guards shouted for order, but there was none to be had. Only exhaustion and the dull determination to keep moving. Behind us, Stalag Luftwaffe faded into a blur of barbed wire and smoke, swallowed by the winter haze. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of road and no promise of survival. We moved west, deeper into Germany, away from the thunder of the Soviet guns. Each man carried what little he owned, a blanket tied with string, a mess tin, a scrap of bread tucked in his coat. Some pushed makeshift sleds, others limped, leaning on sticks or on one another. The cold was merciless. Frost crusted our eyelashes and turned our breath to ice. By nightfall, a dozen men had already collapsed. We left them where they fell. The guards were as miserable as we were. Many were older reservists, men too old or wounded for the front, shuffling beside us with the same hollow stare. They feared the Russians more than they hated us. At times, you could see it, a shared desperation that blurred the line between prisoner and captor. Still, cruelty was never far. The younger guards, the ones from the SS detachments, treated the march as punishment. One British airman was shot on the third day for lagging behind. The sound of the rifle cracked through the smell-laden air, and no one dared look back. Food was scarce. We were given a ladle of thin barley soup in the evenings, sometimes nothing at all. When we passed through villages, we scavenged what we could: potato peels, bits of frozen beet, even snow mixed with soot. Once, I traded my belt buckle for half a loaf of bread from a frightened farm girl who watched us from her gate. I can still see her face, pale, trembling, eyes darting between me and the guard. She risked everything for that small act of mercy. At night, we slept in barns, schoolhouses, sometimes just open fields. Men huddled together for warmth, whispering prayers or fragments of songs. I remember one night clearly, early March, the moon like silver on the snow. Harlan lay beside me, coughing hard. His breath sounded wet, heavy. I told him to rest. That would make it through, though I barely believed it myself. By morning, he was gone. We buried him by the roadside under a broken fence post, marking the spot with a piece of his flight jacket. I said nothing. There were no words left to say. The march dragged on for weeks. Town after town blurred together: Schneidemel, Neustetten, Lauenburg, names that meant nothing anymore. Men's faces changed daily, thinner, paler, more ghost than human. Some began talking to people who weren't there. Others simply stopped walking. The guards stopped shooting. They just left the dead in the snow. And yet, somehow, I kept moving. Perhaps it was luck, perhaps stubbornness, or maybe it was Ellen's letter, folded in my boot, worn soft as cloth, that kept my heart beating when my body wanted to quit. By April, the air had softened, the snow turning to mud. The thunder from the east grew distant, replaced by a new sound, the dull rumble of artillery from the west. The war was collapsing around us. You could feel it, like pressure before a storm. One night, as we rested near Beck, Kurger, the commandant approached me again. His uniform was filthy, his face drawn and gray. He asked quietly, "Lieutenant, do you think your people will treat us fairly?" I didn't answer right away. The wind carried the faint sound of bombing in the distance. Finally, I said, "I think the world's tired of killing, Colonel. Maybe that'll count for something." He nodded once, then walked away into the dark. By the first week of April 1945, the snow had melted into gray rivers of mud. Our column, what was left of it, staggered through northern Germany like a caravan of ghosts. The strong helped the weak, though most of us barely had strength to help ourselves. The guards had stopped counting. They no longer cared how many of us remained. Some slipped away at night, deserting in small groups, hoping to find Allied lines or just a place to disappear before the Russians arrived. The countryside was collapsing around us. Bridges lay in ruin, fields abandoned, and the skies filled each night with the distant growl of Allied bombers. Once, from a hilltop, I saw the horizon flash red, Hamburg burning. Even from miles away, you could smell the smoke and oil. Germany was bleeding out before our eyes. We reached a village near Obeck around April 20th. The locals watched from their windows as the guards herded us into an old brick factory that had been turned into a temporary holding site. There were maybe 200 of us left from the original march. We slept on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and the stink of mold. For the first time in months, there was no shouting, no barking orders, just silence and waiting. Kurger was still with us. His uniform hung loose, his once polished boots cracked and mud-caked. Had stopped giving speeches. I saw him sitting alone outside the factory one evening, smoking a thin cigarette, watching the sunset as if trying to memorize it. When I passed him, he said quietly, "It's almost over, Morrison. For you and for us." I didn't know if he meant that as hope or resignation. 2 nights later, the guards vanished. They were simply gone by morning, their rifles left in piles, their boots still lined by the door. Some had fled west, hoping to surrender to the British. Others, we later heard, had thrown away their uniforms and melted into the countryside. We were suddenly free, and yet too broken to believe it. No one shouted or cheered. We just sat there, dazed, staring at the open gate. That afternoon, we heard engines, trucks. A handful of us, myself included, stumbled to the road, waving our arms. The first vehicle rolled into view bearing a white star on its side, a British reconnaissance unit. Armored cars from the Second Army pushing north. The soldiers jumped out, weapons ready, until they saw what we were. I'll never forget the look on their faces, a mix of horror and pity. Jesus Christ, one of them whispered, they're prisoners. They gave us food, biscuits, tea, tins of meat, and told us the war was days from ending. I ate slowly, my stomach too shrunken to handle much. Some men wept, others just sat, holding their rations like sacred relics. For the first time in a year, the air smelled of life and not death. Later that night, as we sat around a small fire the British had built, I saw Kruger again. He had not fled. He stood apart from us, unarmed, hands folded behind his back, watching the sky. I walked over, unsure what to say. He looked tired beyond measure. I suppose this is the end, he said softly. It is, I replied. For all of us. He nodded, then reached into his coat and handed me something, a small, folded piece of paper. A list, he said. Names of the men who died on the march. I thought someone should remember them. Before I could answer, a British sergeant approached and ordered him to join the other captured officers. Kruger turned once, gave me a slight nod, and walked away. I never saw him again. That night, I slept on real blankets for the first time in months. The stars above Lubeck were sharp and cold, but the air felt clean. I dreamed of Ellen, of home, of a sky without searchlights or flak. When I woke at dawn, the war was still not over, but for me, captivity was. I was alive, and for the first time since that day over Koblenz, I dared to believe I would stay that way. The British called it a repatriation center, but to us, it felt like a strange purgatory between two worlds, no longer prisoners, not yet free men. They brought us first to a field hospital outside Lubeck, a collection of canvas tents and wooden huts flying the Union Jack. The doctors there were kind, but their faces carried the shock of what they saw. They weighed me at check-in, 121 pounds. I had been 175 when I flew my last mission. My reflection in a tin mirror looked like someone else, sunken eyes, cheekbones sharp as blades, hair gone gray at the temples. The doctor, a major from Liverpool, pressed his stethoscope to my chest and said softly, "You're lucky, Lieutenant. Another week of that march and you wouldn't be standing here." They fed us carefully, small portions, soft foods, hot tea. Some men couldn't handle it, their bodies had forgotten how to eat. Others just refused food altogether, lost somewhere between relief and disbelief. At night, I would wake in panic, thinking I was still in the barracks, still hearing the clatter of boots and shouted orders. The nurses said it would pass. It didn't. A few days later, a U.S. Army transport arrived. We were loaded into trucks marked power-covered Allied personnel, driven north toward the coast. There, at Travemünde, ships waited to take us back to England. The journey lasted less than a day, but for me, it felt endless. Every sound, every thud of an engine, every metallic creak reminded me of the Corsair, of that last flight, of the sky turning black with flak bursts. When we reached Southampton, crowds were waiting, Red Cross workers, nurses, reporters with notebooks. Someone handed me a bar of chocolate and I cried without meaning to. The sweetness was overwhelming, like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. They sent us to RAF Cosford, a rehabilitation center for returned airmen. The staff there had seen hundreds like me, men who came back from captivity thinner, quieter, changed in ways that medicine couldn't quite measure. The first week was all tests, physical, psychological, endless questions. Did I remember my capture? Could I describe the camp? Did I witness executions? One officer asked, "Do you harbor hatred toward your captors, Lieutenant Morrison?" I thought for a long time before answering. "Some," I said, "but mostly, I just feel tired." He nodded, as if that was the answer had expected. At Cosford, I found myself surrounded by other survivors, men who had flown in the same skies, fought the same war, and carried the same ghosts. We shared stories late into the nights. A Canadian pilot named McDougall had escaped during the march and been recaptured. Another, a British Spitfire pilot, confessed he couldn't sleep unless he heard rain against the roof. It sounds like flak, and somehow that feels safer. We laughed, but none of it was funny. Letters began to arrive. One morning, The nurse handed me an envelope from Ohio, Ellen's handwriting. My hand shook so badly I could barely open it. She wrote that she had heard the news of my liberation on the radio, that she had never stopped believing I was alive. Come home soon, she ended. The house still smells like your pipe tobacco. I read that letter every night for the next month. By early May, word came that the war in Europe was officially over. The camp erupted in cheers, but I sat quietly by the window, watching the sunset fade over the airfield. Freedom, I realized, was not something you simply stepped back into. It was something you had to relearn, like breathing after being underwater too long. When I finally stood again before an aircraft, a battered C-47 waiting to take us home, I hesitated. The engines roared, the propellers cutting the air, and for a moment my chest tightened. Then I climbed aboard. I didn't look back. The C-47 touched down at LaGuardia Field in late May 1945. From the air, New York looked impossibly bright, streets humming with life, cars glinting like silver, people moving freely beneath a sky untouched by war. I pressed my forehead to the window and felt a knot in my chest. It had been almost 2 years since I'd last seen America. 2 years since I'd been just another man, not a number behind wire. They kept us at Mitchell Field on Long Island for a week, processing, debriefing, trying to turn soldiers back into civilians. The Army had a system for everything: medical exams, psychiatric interviews, even classes on how to readjust to peace. But there was no system for the quiet, for the way the world suddenly felt too large, too loud, too alive. The morning they handed me my discharge papers, I held them like a passport to a life I wasn't sure how to live anymore. I took a train west, crossing state after state until the land flattened into the wide green stretches of Ohio. The fields were in bloom. Children waved as the train passed somewhere. A radio played Don't Fence Me In. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, I watched it all through the window as if it belonged to someone else. When I stepped off at Toledo Union Station, Ellen was there. She looked almost exactly as I remembered, her hair tucked beneath a scarf, her eyes bright but uncertain. For a long moment, we just stood, staring. Then she ran to me, and I held her tighter than I thought my body could manage. She smelled like lilacs and laundry soap, and for a moment, the noise of the world faded. We didn't speak much that first night. Words felt fragile. She cooked a real dinner: roast chicken, potatoes, warm bread, and I ate slowly, as though afraid the food might vanish. When she finally asked about the camp, I told her, "It's over now." That was all I could manage. In the weeks that followed, I tried to settle back into the rhythms of ordinary life. Mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons repairing the fence, evenings listening to the radio. Yet everything seemed slightly out of tune. I'd wake at night to the sound of the wind and think it was the whistle of artillery. Once, I startled so badly at a car backfiring that I dropped a glass and cut my hand open. Ellen said nothing. She just held my hand until the bleeding stopped. People in town treated me like a hero. They wanted stories, what it was like to fly the Corsair, to fight over Europe, to be captured. But every time I opened my mouth, the words caught somewhere between my throat and my memory. I learned to smile, to nod, to say, I was lucky. That answer seemed to satisfy them. One afternoon, the mail brought a letter from England. The envelope was stamped with the insignia of the Royal Air Force Records Office. Inside was a short note and a list of names, the men from Stalag Luftwaffe who hadn't made it home. At the bottom was a line written in another hand, recovered from the effects of Oberstleutnant H. Kurger, deceased, Beck, April 1945. I stared at that note for a long time. Kurger had kept his word, had made sure the dead weren't forgotten, even when he must have known his own end was near. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and copied each name carefully into a small leather notebook. It felt like the least I could do, maybe the only thing. By the end of that summer, the world had moved on. Soldiers returned, parades rolled down city streets, and the papers spoke of rebuilding. But for many of us, the war didn't end, it just went quiet. Sometimes, when I looked at the sky and saw a plane cutting through the clouds, my heart would still jump. For a split second, I'd smell oil and cordite again, hear the rush of wind, the hum of the Corsair's engine. Then it would fade, and I'd remind myself, I'm home. I made it. Freedom, I was learning, wasn't a place. It was a thing you carried, fragile as paper, inside you, something you had to keep choosing. Every day. Autumn came early in 1946. The Ohio air turned crisp, the fields golden and dry. I'd been home over a year, but peace still didn't sit quite right. Life had resumed its steady rhythm: work, church on Sundays, Dinners with friends who spoke about the future as if the past had never happened. Yet, for me, the war still lived just beneath the surface, like an ember that refused to die. Some nights I dreamed of the march, snow, endless footsteps, men disappearing into white silence. Other times, I saw the Corsair diving through smoke, the Rhine below me. I'd wake soaked in sweat, heart pounding, Ellen's hand resting gently on my shoulder. She never asked what I'd seen. She seemed to understand that there were places words couldn't reach. In late September, a letter arrived from Washington, an invitation to attend a reunion of the 8th and 9th Air Forces in Chicago. The letter was signed by Colonel William Parker, who had commanded my fighter group before Koblenz. I hesitated at first. I wasn't sure I wanted to see those faces again, reminders of the men who hadn't come back. But Ellen urged me to go. "You need to talk to people who understand," she said. "Not everyone left the war behind." So I went. The reunion was held in a grand hotel off Michigan Avenue, the kind of place I'd never stayed before the war. The lobby was full of uniforms, some crisp, some faded, and laughter that carried both pride and sorrow. Men hugged, saluted, traded stories. I felt awkward, like an imposter among my own kind, until I heard someone shout, "Jack Morrison, you son of a gun." It was Red Halley, my old wingman, the last voice I'd heard on the radio before going down over the Rhine. I hadn't known if he'd survived. He looked older, broader in the shoulders, but the grin was the same. "Thought you bought it," he said, clapping my back. "Damn good to see you, Jack." We spent hours talking about the squadron, the missions, the friends we'd lost. Red told me had been shot down a month after me but rescued by partisans in France. Had spent the rest of the war flying recon for the Army Air Forces. "Heard about your time in that camp," he said quietly. "Hell of a thing. You did what you had to do." I didn't answer right away. "So did we all," I finally said. That night, after the banquet and the toasts, I stepped outside. The city lights glittered on the surface of Lake Michigan. I lit a cigarette, my first in months, and watched the smoke curl upward. Colonel Parker joined me after a while. He looked at me thoughtfully and said, "You ever think about flying again?" "Every day," I admitted. "But I'm not sure I could climb into a cockpit without looking for flak." He nodded. "Some of us go back to the air, some don't. The trick is to find something else worth living for." I thought of Ellen, of the small house by the river, of quiet mornings with coffee and the sound of the wind in the trees. "I think I already did," I said. Before leaving Chicago, I visited the Field Museum, wandering among fossils and old bones. There was a strange comfort in seeing things that had survived millions of years. Proof that even after fire and ruin, something always endures. On a whim, I pulled out my small leather notebook, the one with the names Kruger had saved, and left a copy with the museum archivist. "For record," I told him, "so they're not forgotten." He accepted it with a solemn nod. When I returned home, the sky over the fields was full of migrating geese, their cries echoing high above. I watched them until they disappeared into the clouds, feeling something lift inside me, a kind of peace I hadn't known since before the war. That night, I told Ellen I wanted to learn to fly again, not for war, but for the sheer joy of it. She smiled and said, "Then we'll start saving for lessons." For the first time in years, I believed her. By the spring of 1948, I was flying once more, though not the way I used to. No roaring Corsair, no heavy flight suit or oxygen mask, no engine growl shaking the bones. Just a small Piper J3 Cub, yellow as sunlight, floating above the fields outside Findlay, Ohio, where I'd found work as a crop survey pilot. It wasn't combat. It wasn't glory. It was something better, quiet. The first time I took the stick again, my hands trembled. The instructor, an old barnstormer named Eddie Wallace, watched me from the back seat, grinning through his goggles. "Like riding a bike, Lieutenant," he shouted over the engine. "Only the bike's a few hundred feet up." He was right. The moment the wheels lifted from the grass, something inside me unlocked. The world fell away, the farms, the roads, the weight of memory, all shrinking beneath the hum of the propeller. For the first time in years, I wasn't a prisoner or a soldier or even a survivor. I was just a man in the sky again, where everything made sense. I bought my own plane later that summer, a used Taylor craft that cost nearly all of my savings. Ellen didn't protest. She said flying seemed to put color back in my face. On weekends, I'd take her up with me. She was nervous at first, clutching my arm as the wind rushed through the open cockpit. But then she laughed, a real laugh, clear and bright, and said, "It feels like we're part of the clouds." We began flying to small towns, landing in meadows, sometimes just circling over the rivers. People would wave, and kids would chase our shadow across the fields. Those flights became our quiet ritual, a way to rewrite what flight meant for me. No more flak, no more fear. Just the sound of wind and the steady heartbeat of the engine. Still, the war lingered in small ways. I couldn't bear loud bangs or the smell of burning oil. Every spring, when the snow melted, I'd think of the march. And some nights, I'd wake before dawn, heart pounding, certain I'd heard the bark of German shepherds in the distance. I started keeping a journal, writing down what I remembered, not just for myself, but for the men who didn't come home. Names, faces, fragments of stories. I wanted to preserve them before time eroded the details. The notebook grew thick, pages filled with the handwriting of a man trying to make peace with ghosts. One afternoon, while sorting old letters, I found Ellen reading the journal. I started to protest, but she shook her head gently. "You should finish this," she said. "Not just for them. For you." That night, I wrote for hours. The memories came easier than I expected. The faces of Harland, McDougall, even Kruger. By midnight, I realized something. I wasn't writing about war. I was writing about endurance, about what men carry, and what they choose to set down. In 1949, I received a letter from the U.S. Navy. The morning of October 14, 1944, started like any other at RNAS Stretton, the British airfield that hosted a handful of American squadrons under Joint Command. I was flying a Vought F4U Corsair, one of the Navy's finest fighters, fast, brutal, and unpredictable, much like the men who flew it. We had been briefed to escort a formation of B-24 Liberators striking a munitions depot near Koblenz, deep inside German territory. It was supposed to be a clean run, in and out before noon. The weather betrayed us first. Low cloud cover rolled in across the channel, and by the time we crossed the Rhine, visibility had dropped to near zero. The Germans were waiting. Flak burst around us like black blossoms, shaking the Corsair until every rivet screamed. I remember the smell of oil and cordite, the flash of an exploding B-24 ahead of me. And then, the engine shuddered. A single shell had torn through the cowling and shredded the oil line. The Corsair, my beautiful blue devil, began to die. I radioed my wingman, Ensign Red Halley, but static drowned his reply. Smoke poured into the cockpit. I pulled the canopy release and prayed the fire wouldn't follow me out. The last thing I saw before I jumped was the Rhine River cutting through the valley, like a strip of dark glass. The next was the ground coming up fast. I hit a patch of forest somewhere west of Koblenz, my parachute snagging in a line of tall pines. My right leg took the worst of it, a bad twist, maybe a fracture. I cut myself loose, crawled under a fallen log, and waited. The cold was unbearable, but fear kept me awake. For hours, I listened to the sound of trucks and dogs in the distance. The Germans were sweeping the area. They found me by morning. 2 soldiers in gray field coats, rifles slung across their shoulders, came through the trees. One shouted, and before I could even raise my hands, a rifle butt slammed into my ribs. They were young boys, really, no older than 20. I told them I was an American naval officer. They laughed and called me Flieger, flyer. They took my sidearm, my watch, and the small photo of my wife, Ellen, from my flight jacket pocket. I never saw it again. That night, they brought me to a makeshift outpost near Beaufort, where a truck waited to carry prisoners east. I remember the smell of diesel, the frost forming on the canvas roof, and the realization that I had crossed from the world of flyers into the world of prisoners. The war, for me, was over, but what came next would test the limits of what a man could endure, and what he could learn to live with. The transport truck rattled eastward for hours, bouncing along frozen roads lined with leafless birch trees and half-buried artillery pieces. The guards smoked and talked in low voices, laughing from time to time. Though none of us prisoners spoke, there were 6 of us in the back, 2 British, 1 Canadian, and 3 Americans, all shot down within days of each other. We didn't exchange names that first night. We just sat there, wrapped in silence and the stink of diesel, knowing that introductions could wait until survival no longer felt like a gamble. By dawn, we reached the rail yard at Limburg and Derlan. From there, a train took us north, Oxcars, 40 men to a car, no heat, no water. I later learned we were bound for Stalag Luft IV, a Luftwaffe-run prisoner of war camp near the town of Gross Tychow, then in Pomerania, now Tychowo, Poland. It was January 1945, the coldest winter I've ever known. When the train doors opened after 2 days, the cold hit like a wall. Rows of watchtowers loomed over barbed wire fences that glittered in frost. Guards with machine guns paced along the perimeters. Behind them, wooden barracks squatted in the snow, smoke rising from a few cracked chimneys. We were herded out, counted, lined up. A German officer, thin, hawk-faced, his voice clipped with authority, looked us over as though we were livestock. He introduced himself as Oberstleutnant Heinrich Kruger, Camp Commandant. He told us, in perfect English, "You are airmen. You are not criminals. Behave as such, and you will live to see your home again." That promise meant little then, but I would come to learn he was, in his own way, a man of peculiar honor, rare among his peers. Inside the barracks, the air was heavy with sweat, damp straw, and the faint smell of kerosene. Dozens of men lay on wooden bunks, wrapped in blankets so thin they might as well have been